Hi BookTube, and welcome to another nonfiction review. This review is dedicated to Elaine Castillio, who wrote the book How to Read Now, which I reviewed in January, and there will be a link in my description box. On page 8 of her book, she said, "But I was occasionally alarmed during book tour events when I would make reference to playing in the dark and realize that many in the audience had not read it, and indeed seemingly hadn't ever had a substantial reckoning with the politics, especially racial politics, of their reading practices." Now, if I had been in the audience for any of the talks that Elaine Castillio gave, I'd have been another one of those people who would have alarmed her. So today, to remedy that, we are now reviewing Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination by Toni Morrison. These are the transcriptions of the 1990 William E. Massey Lectures in the History of American Civilization, or rather, the transcriptions of Toni Morrison's answers to questions raised during those lectures. Published in 1992, and you can see very slender book, less than 100 pages, but you will need more time with it. I certainly needed more time with it than those 98 pages might indicate. Not available on Kindle. You do have to get a print copy in the UK. It is available, however, in the United States on Kindle. Shrug. I cannot explain that. I bought my copy from Oxfam online. You can see January 2026, shortly after I finished Elaine Castillio's book, because I was ashamed. I thought, oh, what is this book by Toni Morrison that I should have read that is nonfiction, and it's about literary criticism and engaging with racial politics in American literature? And I thought, I need to know. I need to know. Now I do. We won't have our usual author biography spot here because I've already done a potted biography of Toni Morrison, and I emphasize that it's very short and that really this is another author where reading a full biography, I would say, is essential. I will post a link in my description box to the short biography I did in my review of The Bluest Eye. What I'm going to do here is talk about 3 online resources that I think are quite helpful if you're thinking of looking at Toni Morrison's works in depth. Certainly the first one, the Toni Morrison Society, that was founded in 1993, and they catalogue all the scholarly work about Morrison's writing. They organize lectures and other events in the United States, I believe. They work with schools to assist teachers who want to teach Morrison's writing and want some guidance. And there's going to be a link in my description box, of course, to the Society website. And also, if you are studying Morrison, there is a link on the resources page of the Society website, which has an extensive biography of works about Morrison or mentioning Morrison. The second resource that I think might be helpful is the 2020 documentary, The Pieces I Am. Now, this is available to watch online from the Public Broadcasting Society, PBS, website. If you have access to this, those in the United States and Canada, I believe you will be able to. UK viewers will not have access this way. If you are a UK viewer who has Amazon Prime Video, then you can purchase the documentary to view for £6.99. And lastly, Toni Morrison, a teaching and learning resource collection. This is a site edited by Amardeep Singh, who's a professor of English at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and it's materials contributed by students. It includes a biographical note on Morrison's life and career, something a little bit longer than my biography, most likely, overviews of each of Morrison's novels, reception histories for each of the novels. How were they critically received? Annotated bibliographies of criticism related to Toni Morrison's writings, overviews of Morrison's nonfiction writing and drama, including this book, Playing in the Dark. And then also what I found interesting, because I did go and have a look at this, maps and data relevant to Morrison's novel. So the question is asked, what does Toni Morrison's map of the United States look like? What cities and states feature in her books, and what geographic patterns can we trace? I mean, I know some of the settings, certainly some of the books are set in the state where she grew up in Ohio, but there are others as well. And again, these are fantastic resources if you are looking into Toni Morrison's works in more depth and you would like some other materials to help you understand her books. These 3 locations, I think, will do that. Let's go on now and talk about the structure of this tiny little book. It begins with a 9-page preface. Then there are just 3 chapters, which I believe are covering the 3 lectures and answering questions raised. But each chapter will have about 30 pages. The text on the page is double-spaced. There is a 1.5 inch bottom margin, quite a generous margin for note-taking, 1/2 inch margins on around the sides of the page, and it is a serif font, if that is something that you need to know. I understand serif fonts are more difficult for some people to read. Now, this is the most important thing. The style and the register of the vocabulary are exclusive, not inclusive. Toni Morrison is not writing for a popular audience, and the less you know about American literature and the less you know about literary criticism, then the less you can get from the essays. But I have more to say about that. Let's just talk quickly about the resources in the book. There isn't a great deal. There's just a few notes within the text and a page of acknowledgements. There is a note inserted just before chapter 1, which reads, "Playing in the Dark is the result of questions raised in 3 William E. Massey senior lectures given at Harvard University." Okay, so we know the context now. Imagine the qualifications and the expectations of the people who sat in the audience for those lectures. That's the kind of audience that is being addressed in these essays. And okay, before anybody throws their hands in the air now and says, well, that's too hard for me. I'm not going to read a book that's so hard. I'm going to make, for what it's worth, because I mean, you can choose not to read this book, but for what it's worth, I'd like to make an argument in support of reading a book that you think is too hard for you, because that's exactly what I did. I'm going to suggest that it matters to try. My knowledge of American literature is very poor. I've mostly focused in my personal reading and, of course, at university on British English literature. If I wanted to focus on improving my American literature to the point where I would really gain something from some of Toni Morrison's words in this book, I'd have to do a heck of a lot of reading, crazy amount. My knowledge of literary criticism, yes, that was helped a little bit at university, but I still feel that I was just introduced to the idea as almost at a surface level. Yes, I now know there are different approaches to criticism, but that's really as far as it went. We didn't work with that in detail. We weren't asked to take different critical stances, for example. And I had a tough time reading this little book. I absolutely did. It took a long time to read these 98 pages. I had to reread often, and often the rereading did not enlighten me as much as I hoped it would. I had read virtually none of the works that Toni Morrison quotes in her responses. And yet it has dramatically altered the way I think now, and the way I will think when I am reading American literature, when I'm reading British literature as well, in a different way. And I'm going to talk more about that in the rabbit hole. But I do think that sometimes, even though a book might be rather torturous reading, and you might find that you read a page and think, I think I got this concept, but I don't think I got much else. This is still very worthwhile. If the concept is helpful, if the concept is one that you can use and makes a difference to your reading or writing going forward, that can be worth not really understanding the rest of what is on the page. I also found, of course, that coming back, which I have done as part of getting the script ready for this review, coming back to her book and reading the passages yet again, slowly but surely, the ideas are beginning to unfold themselves and show themselves to me. So that's my argument for reading a book that is too hard. If I can use an analogy, when we all read for pleasure, that could be the equivalent of walking through a hothouse that is filled with flowers in bloom, and we just get to cut ourselves a bouquet and take it with us. That's lovely, isn't it? Little effort, lots of immediate pleasure. Now, harder reading is really like having to build the hothouse yourself and plant the seeds and cultivate them, learn how to take care of the various plants so they flower well. You will get pleasure later. You will. And you will get pleasure from repeated work being done. And so it's satisfaction that comes with time. It's a long-term thing rather than a short-term hit. I want to talk, though, in more detail about what is it that Morrison puts forward in this book, as much as I understand it, okay? And bear in mind that I feel that I'm still coming to terms with understanding what she's saying. But Morrison puts forward in these responses that there is a blind spot, what she calls an ornamental vacuum in literary discourse whenever American literature is analyzed. And this blind spot occurs because when there is any consideration of race or racism when discussing a work of American literature, the focus has tended to be, Morrison says, on those who are on the receiving end of racial prejudices. And she immediately has to spend a couple of paragraphs, needlessly, I think, but there we go. I don't live in America, so maybe this is needful. But she spends a couple of paragraphs saying, I'm not saying stop doing that. I'm not saying stop looking at American literature with a view to what is the effect of this literature on those who are not white. She says, no, please keep doing that. But what she said is, we also need another focus. And that focus needs to be on the consequences of the way race is handled on those who perpetrate racism. And I sat back as soon as she said that, and I thought, I've never thought of that, and I don't even know how to think that. And it's been rereading this book and revisiting it that's beginning to, I can feel a concept beginning to open. And I also thought, why is Morrison the first person, I think, to state this in writing? Hey, don't just look at race in terms of those who are affected by racism. Also look at race in terms of how are those affected who perpetrate it, who think that way. What are they doing to themselves in literature? What does the literature and the way they write it do to them? Morrison does point the finger, and it's very carefully and diplomatically worded, pointing at literary critics, and she implies that they really should be filling this vacuum. She says the assumption of literary historians and critics has been, and I'm quoting her now, traditional canonical American literature is free of, uninformed and unshaped by the 400-year-old presence of first Africans and then African Americans in the United States. She also goes on to say, again quoting, because American literature has been clearly the preserve of white male views, white male genius and power, those views, genius and power are without relationship to and removed from the overwhelming presence of Black people in the United States. I feel like I should try to explain that. Well, she goes on to say more. She says, and again I'm quoting her, Black people signified little or nothing in the imagination of white American writers. And I think when she's saying this, she's saying, what effect does that have on us as white people? If everything we see in literature either signifies little about the Africans and African Americans, I guess I'm trying to speak as an American, even though I don't live there. If you live in the United States, what does all that American literature do as you're reading it if it either does not mention or Black people play a very insignificant role in that literature? And I feel like I should jump forward to what I'm listening to at the moment in audiobook is Mallory Blackman's autobiography, Just Saying. And it just so happens, and again, this is beautiful synchronicity, as I was writing this script, I got to the point in Mallory Blackman's book when she was talking about her childhood and her voracious reading. I mean, she just literally would clear libraries out of whatever books they'd let her borrow and read. She would go to the library on a Saturday, stay there all day reading books. Then when she'd finished reading, she would take out other books, as many as she could be allowed to take, hoping that that would be enough for her reading during the week. That's how much she read. But she says, after having read hundreds of books, literally she feels she can state hundreds of books, she felt completely unmentioned. There were no people like her in the books. And she says, in case you think children are not affected by that, she said, I was affected by that because I was never mentioned. Or when Black people were mentioned, they were for comic effect. They were minor characters. They just didn't have real personalities. They existed on the sidelines with very little real agency as part of the story. And I think this is interesting because there, Malorie Blackman is saying, here's the effect that had on me. So she's taking the traditional critical approach. Here's the effect that had on me, a non-white person. And I had to sit back and think, so what effect, because I read not all the same books, but I was a voracious reader as a child, what effect would it have had on me never seeing Black people or only sort of getting them mentioned in the margins or they're always a bit of comic relief or something, but they're never fully formed people with agency in the story. How would that affect me? And I thought, well, the truth, as I began to think about it, as I began to think of me now versus me in the past, is that I didn't really understand. It was like that was an invisible part of my world. I wasn't thinking about Black people, non-white people, how they might think, how they might view the world, how they might view me. I didn't, because literature didn't mention it, didn't fill it out. Now I find the more I am reading literature written by non-white people, I can feel it changing the way I think when I do think about non-white people, which I do more often. So it's having two effects on me, the perpetrator, because I have to include myself in the group that perpetrates racism, because I was subjected to these same influences, which effectively, those influences made non-white people invisible or barely visible only as little stereotypes moving in the margins of my world, not in my main world. Now they're starting to come into my main world and they're starting to be fleshed out people, and that is changing the way I think. So immediately I'm beginning to see the effect of what Morrison is saying is, and perhaps it's a strong argument for make sure your reading is diverse, because you are missing something. Your whole universe and your viewpoint will be altered if you, as a white person, begin to read more non-white authors and take in stories of primarily non-white characters. It shifts your worldview. It starts to open out things that you probably didn't see or think about before. You find yourself thinking differently when you're presented with a new story. Malorie Blackman also mentions that she didn't think when she was a child that there were any non-white writers. She never saw pictures, the lovely inside the cover flap pictures of the author. She never saw any non-white faces. And Morrison talks about her experience as a writer in this book. She talks about how she knows the way that a writer has to extend themselves into the consciousness of other people who are not themselves. And also the fact that what actually comes out on the page of a novel or a short story, it's not entirely a consciously formed product, even though it might feel like that. I think everyone who does creative writing and who's watching this video right now knows what Morrison means. Yes, you plan what you're going to write, and you have, plots, and you have character descriptions and so on. But when you actually get the text of the story down on the page, as it begins to come down, you also sense that something that you're not consciously aware of is happening and getting itself down on the page. And this always, it actually spooks me a little when I have experienced it, because I think, what is going on? Where does this come from? The way the story comes together and the way the characters develop, which seems out of my control. And yet I think it must be me. It must be a subconscious part of me. If the writer is white American or white anything, they must have a mental construction for dealing with the existence of non-white people. And if that construct is based on experience of invisibility, or when visible, stereotyped in some way, is that going to affect how they also can write non-white characters? All these insights, which I don't think I would have thought of if I weren't reading non-white writers, but also taking in Toni Morrison's concepts and thinking, this is something I now need to be more consciously aware of when I'm reading. And there's one more thing I want to add, and this actually relates, the more synchronicity. I was watching a review by Marian H., and again, I'll put a link in my description box, she had just finished reading Minor Detail by the writer Adania Shibli. And she was describing one of the protagonists in that novel, who is I believe, a captain in the Israeli army, because the book is about abuses perpetrated by the Israeli army on an Arab girl. And Marian was noting how odd it was that this character, when he was speaking, because it was a first-person narrative voice, he seemed to notice the details of many, many things in his day, but not so much the details of the attack and the atrocity committed on this little girl. That is, he had a sharp focus on things that you might call less important, and less of a focus on the things that you would think would be unbelievably important. If something has just happened to a small child, if they've been abused by the soldiers in your command, surely this would loom larger than everyday details about the way you do your admin. Or, I mean, I'm not familiar with the details in the book, but I got the feeling that they were more mundane, that what the writer focused on was more mundane. And Marian and I were having a comment conversation about this, because I suddenly had a moment where my mind flashed back to reading American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, wherein Patrick Bateman, the protagonist, also has this perceptual flaw. He can focus on tiny, tiny details of his clothing, of his business cards, of what somebody said to him in a meeting, which he can go over and over in his head. And yet, all the while that he's obsessing about these tiny, mundane details of his life, he is actually planning and carrying out murders of innocent young women. And we find this out when you read American Psycho only when the narrative switches from his first-person point of view to third person. That's when you find out what he's actually doing while he's obsessing about his business cards and his suit and which tie he's wearing, and is it the right tie, and is he impressing the other people in the meeting with his tie and his business cards. You find out in the third-person parts of the narrative that he's actually invited a prostitute into his apartment and slowly tortured her and killed her, and then got rid of and you just thought... And it's a horrible disconnect, but I begin to think that this also has resonance with what Toni Morrison is saying, that there is a kind of, there's a perceptual gap, a blind spot that perhaps all white people have, because not because we deliberately set out to, but because our cultural intake and literature as part of that intake gives us a blind spot to everything that is not about us and about our culture and about our society. And that's all we're presented with. And so we perhaps don't think as completely as we ought about those who are, whom that culture excludes or only brings in certain ways. And again, these are, I could go on, and I feel like, okay, can you get the idea that I'm going to be revisiting Toni Morrison's book, but also always beginning to look at a piece of fiction differently. It has made me look differently at The Tale of Sleepy Hollow. And I don't have time in this review to take Toni Morrison's critical principles and apply them to The Tale of Sleepy Hollow, but I'd like to. So there's probably going to be another video coming up where I take her theories and begin to look at how they might be applied to Washington Irving's famous story. But that must wait for another time. I think I've talked long enough now. If you can't tell that this book did something, that these only 90 pages absolutely agitated me and shifted, created seismic, Teutonic plate shifts in my cultural brain setup. Yes, that is what's happened. And Elaine Castillio had already started that, but now I understand why she was so shocked that people hadn't read this book. I think this is really an important book to try to digest, even though, yes, it's difficult. It's not an easy read. But once I began to get what she might be saying, even only part of it has already sort of unlocked something. And I feel that I perceive what I read differently. Anyway, that's enough for that. I'm going to come back in a few days' time, and we're going to do another Middlemarch meditation. We're going to finish chapter 31, and then it will be September. Oh, are you getting ready with plans for that? I am. Yeah, I wish you good luck in whatever you set out to do with your September reading. That's it, everybody. Take care of yourselves. See you next time. Bye-bye.